Hello, everybody. I've got about 30 minutes to try to unravel a little bit basic Christian history throughout Europe. How are you going to squeeze 2,000 years in 30 minutes? It's going to have to take a few parts, probably. We'll see. So I'll put my high up here. You might want to take notes on this. If you're new to this information, it'll teach you a lot. It's pretty simple, basic stuff, but this is my map of Europe here. If you can't tell, here's Turkey and Greece. Here's Italy, Spain and France, Africa, England. Okay. Yeah, I don't claim to be an artist by any stretch of the imagination. So let's just get started and start pouring into this. Now you have from the year 33. If we buy that exact date, we'll just go with it. Okay. 33 from Christ's death to the Council of Nicaea in 325. Christians were persecuted throughout the Roman Empire. The Romans controlled all of or most of Europe, at least half of it or so. Didn't really control the Goths and stuff up to the north. Now in 325, Constantine decided he really needed to assert some authority over the Christian churches. He really needed to have the backing of enough people in his empire to fight his wars, because if his own empire's divided, how's he going to be able to fight, and he needed that. So he concocted this story about, I'll say concocted, I wasn't there. I can't say he didn't see a big cross in the sky that said in Latin, in this sign conquer, and showed the sign of the cross in the sky. But I suspect that he didn't really see that. But, who's going to question the emperor? If the emperor says he sees it, you say, yes, sir, you saw a cross in the sky. So nobody's really going to challenge that at the time, but I wasn't there. So we'll challenge it a little bit now. We're a little bit safer looking 1,700 years into the past. But it's interesting that the Council of Nicaea in 325 is our first date we're going to put up here on the board. Now, Council of Nicaea is when they first established what books would be canonized in the Bible. Before this time, many Christians throughout Europe were Arian. That's not the right word. What was the word? I forgot the word all of a sudden. I'll look at that real quick if I could find it. I forgot. Well, they were Trinitarian. I'll just use the word Trinitarian. Maybe as Arius. I can't remember. Well, anyway, they were Unitarian, not Trinitarian. So they believed only in God the Father was God and Jesus was not God for the most part. So most of the followers throughout the Roman Empire were Unitarian, which is just simple fact. And that didn't change for a long time. That didn't mean there were no Trinitarians at the time, but that's, for the first 300 years, that's what many of the Christians of Europe were. A strong majority were Unitarian, okay? Now, 325, Constantine decides that he needs to assert some authority over the church. Persecution wasn't working. Feeding them to the lions and burning them at the stake was only growing them everywhere, and it was making it hard to win wars. He had battles to fight and places to conquer and things to do, people to rape, stuff like that. So he really needed the support of the Christians. So he dominated Christianity through the Council of Nicaea, where they met and decided what books would be in the canon of the Bible. So he didn't decide himself this book would be in it and this would not. No, he brought Christians from all over the empire, which obviously, surprisingly, they weren't too fearful to come to the guy who had been, to the head of the Roman Empire that had been persecuting them at all this time. Because they had grown in such numbers and were so big, and he calls them all, and they just show up, which is really amazing. So some books didn't get put into this, and I still say to this day, how is it that we today are bound by the the edicts of a Roman emperor who died 1,700 years ago nearly. Why does he get to say, or his council get to say, which books are in the Christian Bible, and somehow we don't get to add or subtract from that? What makes the law of a long dead Roman emperor of any validity whatsoever to us? Why should we trust a large group of these people who were Unitarians, to put together this Bible that we think differently? Well, one of the things they established to fight these Unitarians, okay, was they started establishing a Trinitarian doctrine. The Nicene Creed started to stamp down on the Unitarian doctrine, forcing a large amount to slowly convert over. So the Trinitarians began to get their power right there. And then you had councils, okay, thereafter, many other councils that established other legally official rules for the Church of Rome, which at this time was still centered in Rome. But shortly after, Constantine, renamed Byzantium Constantinople, and then the Roman emperor after him, moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople over in Turkey. Now, there was good reason for that. You had all these Goths up here that didn't believe in any of this, and they were running away from the Huns and invading in, trying to seek protection from the Romans in here, and they overwhelmed them through massive immigration. Well, when that happened, that weakened the empire, so they had to move the capital over here to Constantinople, and then finally in 479 AD, we'll just put that date on there, you had the fall of the Roman Empire, okay? The Western Roman Empire fell to the Goths, okay? And you had the new capital of the Roman Empire over here in Constantinople. Now, the Roman Empire did not cease to exist, nor did its church. It simply moved from west to east. What we now call this as the Byzantine Empire was not known as the Byzantine Empire at this time. It was known as the Roman Empire with its new capital in Constantinople. Only in modern times have we begun calling it the Byzantine Empire. They called it the Roman Empire. Now, so the Roman Empire in the east now moved into where in a Greek-speaking area. Latin was more on this side. Though I'm sure probably I'd have to fact check this, but probably the early emperor spoke both Latin and Greek, I imagine. When they first moved to Constantinople, the large majority of the people spoke Greek. So it began later to be called the Greek Orthodox Church, but there's this big misconception now that the Greek Orthodox Church came from the Roman Church. Nothing could be further from the truth. As we're going to see, it's actually the Roman Church came from the... Now, of course, they were already here because they started here just previously, okay? So there were bishops here. But the bishops of the Roman Empire were not popes, okay? There were lots of popes. There were popes in Antioch down here. There was a pope here and a pope here, and because pope was a more general term back then. So for the first 500 years, 479 to the year 800. So that would be what? 330 years or so, 321 years or so. For the first 321 years, you had the Roman bishops that they now call popes, that the current Roman Catholic Church calls the Pope. They were appointed by the Emperor of Constantine. How many people even understand that? Okay, they had legal permission to operate through the civil authority, okay, the Roman Emperor. And what happened in 800 AD started to change things. That's when you began, depending on who you believe, whether you believe it was Charles the Great or whether you believe it was Otto the First, who came later, depending on when you believe the Holy Roman Empire began. But you began to get a new political force solidifying Western Europe around 800. So that means the Western popes, and they had began replacing, getting rid of ones in Antioch and that sort of thing, and the other various popes, and they began to assert authority. They wanted this new political power up here with the Holy Roman Empire. They now had a separate political party that was closer to them than the Roman Empire in Constantinople. So they wanted to get in good with them, and they began to tell the emperor, screw you, okay? So in 1054, here's the next date, you have what's called the Great Schism, where they officially separated between the two. Now you read Wikipedia and you realize that they put some pretty nebulous reasons that aren't really that important, like things about the Eucharist and all this kind of stuff of why they separated. Now this is why they separated. They now wanted the political power over Western Europe. So, and their new authority over the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so this is now what became known as what you call today the Roman Catholic Church, but that didn't exist until 1054. And it's funny that people think that it's the opposite, that somehow this Greek Orthodox Church came from something that didn't exist until 1054. Instead, this broke away from this. Okay, now I understand in the first century the Roman Empire moved its capital from here to here, but it was the same entity. The Roman Empire did not die out until 1453, when the Muslims took over Constantinople, and that was finally the end of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire lasted from 150 BC to 1453. So 1600 years is how long the Roman Empire lasted. Okay. I mean, the only one that lasted longer was the Egyptian Empire, and it lasted thousands and thousands of years. Okay. In various forms. So as far as I know, those are the two longest running cultures and political entities. Now, these councils over here, up until 1054, were establishing certain tenets of legally acceptable Christian doctrine. Okay, but once Rome asserted itself apart from Constantinople, they began what was called the Lateran Councils, where they met and decided their own doctrines. And if some of the crazy stuff like Mariology that was already established in former councils wasn't bad enough, they began to take on more egregious, more ridiculous doctrines like priests can't marry around 1150. And the next council, I believe, established the idea of transubstantiation, the idea that your cracker and your wine literally become the blood and body of Jesus Christ. Because I mean, how sick and crazy is that? I mean, it's obviously scientifically not provable today, and yet they still assert that garbage in the church. And so this church over here would also have used. They would have used more of the received text from which the King James Bible was translated. Hey, Susan, how you doing? So they would have held to that. They would have held on to those texts. In fact, I think the oldest Masoretic text of the Old Testament was found in Russia, not too far from here, because of these guys. But they also would have held on to the received text. That is the large conglomeration of tens of thousands of manuscripts that all agree with each other. Well, that was the manuscripts that was used in we'll call it now the Greek Orthodox Church, which was really just the church of the Roman Empire that had moved eastward back in 325. So over here, they began to use the Latin Bibles. So the one translated in 400 by Jerome. Okay, so you can look that up too. So that became the text of the Roman Catholic Church, and this is what we still use today in our modern. What we translated from what they used today in our King James Bible. Now, this is not to say that I agree with any of these doctrines. In fact, just because these churches do assert some things from the Nicene Creed, of which we do agree, that doesn't mean that we agree with the vast majority of the things they said in most of these councils. Now, it's also interesting that some people believe that, Baptists and so on have asserted the doctrine of transubstantiation. Well, there may be some groups that have done that, but this is an important distinction. With both Constantinople and Rome, you have hierarchical religious entities. Okay, that means they're sort of like a pyramid, and I'm not trying to, please don't misunderstand this and think I'm talking about Illuminati, because every time you see a pyramid, it doesn't mean Illuminati. Okay, I mean, our culture's weird like that, but let's just use a triangle. Okay, and we'll talk about this one right here. You have your priests. Okay, then you have your bishops, and then you have your archbishops, and then you have your cardinals, and at the very top is your pope, right? Well, that's called a hierarchy, okay? One guy over all of it. So that means if one church up here in England decides it doesn't like what the Catholic Church is doing, the pope at the top is going to bring them into line with what they believe, supposedly. At least that's the way it used to work, okay? Same thing would happen over here in the Greek Orthodox, okay? Now, in modern Baptist churches that are independent, or for that matter, any independent church entity, you do not have a hierarchy. All you have is you have a board of deacons and a pastor. That's it. You don't have any control over any other church next to you or anywhere else, anywhere in the world. Okay. There are Baptist denominations like the Southern Baptist, which is a hierarchy, okay, because you have a board and you have, probably a president of the board and that sort of thing. And so and all the churches under them are expected to comply. However, okay, so there may have been some people called Baptists. There may even been independent groups that have taken on transubstantiation and other Catholic doctrines, but by and large, independent churches do not believe in doctrines that came from the Lateran councils and most of the doctrines that came from the councils before that. Especially things like Mariology, transubstantiation, no marriage for priests, which they don't call them priests, of course, in independent Baptist churches today. So it's really important to understand that there is a strong distinction between modern independent Baptist churches and this hierarchical group. all these councils, all these crazy doctrines have been completely ignored and repudiated. At the time of the founding of the United States, people like Give Me Liberty or Death, Patrick Henry, called the Pope the Antichrist, okay? And a lot of our founders thought the Pope was the Antichrist, okay? A lot of Christians early in this country believed that the Pope was the Antichrist. A lot of people still do today. Transubstantiation, the idea that your cracker and your wine, which we use, of course, unleavened grape juice in Baptist churches, because it depicts that there's no corruption in the body and blood of Christ, whereas if you use actual wine that has been fermented and bread that has been leavened, you're showing that there's corruption in the blood and body of Christ. Well, so a Baptist church would not allow any leavened bread or any fermented wine. So we just use grape juice and and an unleavened cracker. Okay. Now, so they've always taught that it was a Catholic heresy in these churches that the blood or that the wine and the cracker become actual body parts of Jesus. I mean, how many times has Jesus been eaten by Catholics? You know how many Catholics grew up over the centuries believing that if they dropped the cracker, that they had committed some horrible sin? And they used to write about this, okay? You look back through some historical books and stuff, and people were scared to death that if they were supposed to bring the cracker from one church to another, if they dropped it or something, that they literally dropped the body of Christ, and they were terrified of the consequences of what they had done. You know, I mean, it is so ridiculous, but they really did believe that. So it's important to understand that when you lose the hierarchy, you have people that can look directly to the Bible itself to get their own doctrines. And then most of the doctrines that were supported in these councils, both the Lateran and the previous councils before that, are clearly not supported in the Bible. So this is just basic Christian history. This is not, I'm not telling you anything about what I'm personally believing or anything at this point. I'm just telling you just the history. So I think I'll get more into how I developed my own understanding of things at another time. But I didn't have much time today, so just putting out this little bit. And I'll make a part 2 here before too long. Thanks for watching.